set up over here. We're going to set up over here. Is that my drink? Okay. Well, I want to check. Is this working? Is this working? Is this working? Is this working? Okay, there. It helps to turn on. Well, hey, good evening, everybody. Thanks for being here. A little bit. Is that better? Is that better? Okay. Very good.
You guys start just no, I just ate down the road.
Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Rob Hogg, State Senator here in Cedar Rapids, and really appreciate you coming out. It's been a long day for Democrats in Cedar Rapids, but it's been a good day. Very grateful that you come out on a Sunday night. And how about a hand for the people working here at Lucky's? Thank you, Lucky's. That's a great place in the heart of Czech Village, and really appreciate their willingness to help us. I want to acknowledge our state representative, Art Stade. Thank you, Art, for being here. I want to acknowledge a candidate for state representative in Hiawatha, Eric Jardy. Maybe future candidate, Christian Andrews. Former state representative and father of Lucky's, Rob Hogg. And Ron Healy, the chair of the Iowa Democratic Veterans Caucus. Thank you, Ron, for being here. So this is one in our series of climate conversations with the candidates for president. Climate change is obviously a very important issue. There you go. I do want to acknowledge some of the people here with some of the environmental groups. We've got John Davis all the way here from Southwest Iowa, climate reality leader with the Al Gore operation. All right, John. Joe Wilkinson with the Iowa Wildlife Federation. Thank you, Joe. Billy Wilson with Biofuels Vision 2020. Thank you, Billy. Come on in. And Phil Langen with the Citizens Climate Lobby Organization here. Thank you. If others of you want to introduce yourself, you get a chance to ask some questions later, and I apologize if anybody wanted to be introduced. I didn't get that done. We had a chance to give a tour to our special guest here tonight, a quick tour to show him what happened with the flood of 2008 and the flood of 2016 in Czech Village in the Newbo neighborhood, and showed him the flood infrastructure that is being built to safeguard our community. Talked to him about the need for watershed management. Talked to him about the fact that we had nearly 20,000 Cedar Rapidians evacuated. We had 1,000 businesses, churches, nonprofits flooded. Virtually every major facility of city and county government. That we're coming back, that the federal government's only providing 18% of the funding. What's going on my head there, Christian? I'm not sure what was on the TV. Okay, very good. And the neat fact that it took the federal government over 10 years to make the commitment to that project, which we obviously need to fix, and we need a president of the United States who will fix that. So this is an issue that is a reality for Cedar Rapids and many other places in Iowa that have been suffering flooding. I'm now concerned with the way the summer's shaping up for a drought. We've got other ecological changes underway in our state that are very damaging, especially in terms of invasive species and other things that are making it harder to preserve our natural areas and to preserve our health and well-being and our productive natural resources in the state. It's my honor to introduce to you a person who served our country in the United States Marines, doing 4 tours of duty in Iraq, who came home, decided to run for office, has been elected to the United States Congress 4 times.
3 times.
3 times.
Let's not get ahead of ourselves.
Okay, 3 times out of Massachusetts, who has helped get more Democrats, especially Democratic veterans across the country, involved through his collective effort known as Serve America. So thank you for doing that. his platform today at the Progress Iowa Corn Feed to make a very strong case for the constitutional duty to initiate impeachment proceedings against the current president. And a real great leader for our country, Seth Moulton, United States Representative from Massachusetts.
Dale, thanks for the tour. It's great to be here, and I can't tell you how much I learned just in the last 45 minutes walking around and seeing the real impacts of climate change on your community. So I'm excited to have this discussion, and I want to get quickly to questions. But you know, I was speaking to a company back in Massachusetts, not too far from where I grew up, last year. And it turns out this company made some of the sophisticated optical devices that we used in the Marines in Iraq. And I was very impressed because I actually had no idea when I was using them in the Marines that they were built so close to my home. So I got all the people on the factory floor together, a group maybe a little bit bigger than this, and I gave them a speech about how important their work was for our national defense. And what a great example of advanced manufacturing they were for everybody right at home in Massachusetts. And then I opened it up to questions, and there was total silence. And I said, look, my job is to take tough questions, so you can ask anything that you want. And there was still silence. And then finally, a woman way in the back raised her hand and she said, "Who are you?" And I said, okay, so do an introduction before you take questions. So I will give you a little bit of an introduction to who I am and why I'm running, and then we'll get to questions ostensibly about climate change, but really anything that you want to ask. So the first thing you should know is that I'm pretty new to politics. This is not what I expected to be doing when I was growing up. I didn't study it in school, didn't volunteer on campaigns. It wasn't in my family. You know, my parents grew up, had a great education and everything, but the first congressman that they met was me. So it was not a family business. But when I was in Iraq, I felt like I saw some of the consequences of failed leadership in Washington. And I saw it in very personal and human terms. Guys who lost their lives because of poor decisions made in Washington, D.C. And I feel like I spent the last 45 minutes seeing some of the consequences of failed leadership in Washington, in this community. Washington needs to be doing a lot better, and that's why I decided to run for Congress back in 2014. I decided to take on an 18-year incumbent in my home district because he'd only passed one bill in 18 years, and I sort of felt like, okay, we could do a little better than that. But I was quickly informed by the Massachusetts Democratic establishment that you're not supposed to run against an 18-year incumbent. In fact, the message they gave to me was, Seth, not only are you going to lose this race, but you'll never be involved in politics again because you dare to take on the establishment. And if you think about it, what they were saying to this young veteran was, Seth, do not participate in the democracy you just risked your life to defend. And that is wrong. That's why I'm so proud of the work of the Iowa Veterans Caucus and all that you are doing to encourage veterans to come back and get involved in politics. So thank you. Now the one thing I will admit they were right about is that it was a tough race. And after our first poll was 7 months in. I've only been campaigning for president for 2.5 months. But we did our first poll after 7 months in that first race. And I was only 53 points down. Which for those of you in the room who don't know politics, it's not very good. Not very good. In fact, my pollster told me it was statistically impossible to win the race and that I actually quit. But the response I was getting on the ground was different. The energy I was hearing from constituents. And so we kept going. We made some changes, but we kept going, and I won that primary by 11 points. And then in a district that voted by 13 points for our Republican governor in Massachusetts, I won by 14. So I've been in tough races before. I frankly love being an underdog, and I admit that I'm an underdog in this race, but that's okay. I got in late because I have a 9-month-old daughter at home, and there was no getting in this presidential race when my wife and I were first-time parents of a 3-month-old. So we're doing okay. We're were trucking along. We were steadily creeping up in the polls. And I'm just really proud to be here tonight to share a little bit of my story and learn from you about how climate change is impacting your community and give you an opportunity to really question me about how I would respond as President of the United States to these challenges that we face as a nation. Is that sufficient?
All right, very good. No, yes, of course. So let's have a little discussion about the climate issue, and of course, if somebody wants to ask something else, I'm not gonna, yell at you and tell you that you're a bad person, because this is what Iowans do, right? We Iowans take this job seriously, right? We're first in the nation, along with New Hampshire, because we do it best, and we like to know our candidates, and we like to know them over time. Let's start with kind of the big immediate. I got so many questions. I'm going to start with one. Think of yours. I've got a series I'd like to go through. We've got enough time to do this. Let me start. You served in Iraq. You're in the Marines. A lot of national security people who look at the climate issue very concerned about it. And I'd like to kind of hear from you a little bit about what you're hearing from people who are military leaders about the issue. Now, I'll give you one tangible example. I wrote a book. I'll give you a copy of it shortly. America's Climate Century. Best book. It will be autographed, Roe. Best book ever written on the subject. Short, accessible, patriotic, and practical. I was speaking in Vermont on the issue. I was doing a 2-week book tour through Vermont and New Hampshire to try to connect with people out there, and then I dropped my son off at college. He didn't go to the University of Iowa like he was supposed to. He went out east. You combine errands. In the climate century, you combine errands, right? And I had somebody raise their hand and say, have you ever looked at the roots of the crisis in Syria? Right? This was 2013, very difficult time in Syria, and of course it continues to this day. And I said, no, I hadn't. And he referred me to a Bulletin of Atomic Scientists article about the roots of that crisis, and it was a crisis fueled by drought, unprecedented in the modern era for Syria, and it destabilized the region and created this huge security problem. I'd like to hear what you've experienced in the service, what you hear from other military leaders about the climate issue.
Thanks, Rob. So, when you're doing this job, as I've done for 4 or 5 years now, you hear a question like that, and as the question is going on, you spend some time thinking about, okay, how am I going to respond to this? Like, what examples am I going to use? And you successfully took the example I was going to use.
Okay.
So good work. I'll come up with another one. To be totally blunt about this, yes, the Department of Defense is very clear that climate change is a major national security issue. And in fact, it's Republicans in Congress who have tried to pass resolutions and amendments to prevent the DoD from acting on it or talking about it or studying on it or responding to it. But they want to do it. And an example of this is actually when I was on my way to Asia on a congressional delegation trip to deal with how things are falling apart in the Pacific because of our illustrious president. And we stopped to refuel in Alaska. And we had a briefing there largely about dealing with the Russian threat and nuclear strategy and whatnot. But at the end of this briefing, the general who was in charge of that base said, I just want to say one more thing. He said, I don't care what you believe about climate change and what causes it, but let me just tell you, we've got a real problem with it here. Because we are unprepared for Russia being able to bring their ships much closer to Alaska than they've ever been able to bring them before. And then we went out to dinner with this guy. He was a, very nice Air Force general. And, had a few drinks, got to learn a little bit more about him. It turned out that he never betrayed his political preferences, per se, but he did mention that his wife was the leading local organizer for Trump. So it's pretty safe to assume that this is a conservative Republican, someone who caveated his talk about climate change by saying, I don't care if you know how it started. Well, we do know what's causing it, okay? But he said that to protect himself politically. But nonetheless, he admits that this is a major problem. It's a major problem for our national security. And it's a very important thing for Democrats to talk about because it's a way to reach Republican voters on this issue. I mean, we should be able to just talk about science. I'm one of the only members of Congress who has a degree in science. I actually have a degree from Harvard in physics, which for everybody who likes to see my resume and not my transcript makes me sound very smart. But we won't go into the details there. Being able to understand science is pretty important to do our jobs. And there's a lot of science denial going on in Congress today. But increasingly, Americans are being confronted firsthand with the threats. And you're right, Rob. There are a lot of people who think that the entire war in Syria would not have started if not for those massive droughts. The biggest resource that we always talk about in the Middle East is what? Oil, right? I mean, that's why the whole Iraq War was originally called the Operation Iraqi Liberation, and then they realized, oh, that's not a good analogy, so we'll come up with freedom instead. But in all seriousness, that's the resource we talk about. That's not what the Iraqis are talking about. That's not what the Turks are talking about. They're talking about how to portion off the water in the Tigris and Euphrates rivers because there's not enough of it to go around. Water is the resource that will be the biggest contentious issue in the Middle East for the next century, not oil. And that's because of climate change. So this has huge implications for our national security. Our Department of Defense realizes this and is developing their strategy to meet these challenges. But when climate change denial continues to go on in Congress, we're not adequately funding these efforts. We're not responding to it sufficiently as a country.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much. Do you have a question or comment for Congressman Moulton that you'd like to share? Joe.
Congressman, according to the 2019 UN report on biodiversity, we face the sixth mass extinction in Earth's history right about now. We could have 1 billion species going extinct, many of them in the next few decades, brought on by climate change, habitat loss, and pollution. This hurts our economy, health, quality of life. As president, will you uphold the Endangered Species Act and fully fund it to help these imperiled plants and animals?
Yes, of course I will, but I'll do a lot more than that. And one of the most recent bills that I sponsored and gotten passed in Congress is called the Save Right Whales Act. That I didn't just sponsor, actually, we wrote it in my office. And we were able to get a bipartisan co-sponsor for it, which is really important because that's the way you can actually get something not just passed through the Democratic House, but actually have a chance to go into the Senate and pass into law. Now, if you know about the legislative process, you get a bill like that passed, then you have to find the money to fund it. There are a lot of great ideas out there that have never been funded. Well, we got money for it in the appropriations package, and then successfully got an amendment to the appropriations bill to actually get that money increased. And here's the reason why it's so important. There are about 418 right now, right whales left in the world. North Atlantic right whales, that's it, 418. We can either be the generation that watches them go extinct, like the generation that saw the dodo bird and the passenger pigeon go away, or we can be the generation that steps up and saves them. And I certainly know what side of history I want to be on. And I want my daughter to be able to grow up and go on a whale watch and see a right whale, and not think that her dad was in Congress and let it go extinct. So every one of these fights, these pieces of legislation or the fights you have at the UN or wherever else, it is a fight. In this case, the Maine lobstermen didn't like the bill because we make them make some modifications to how they catch lobsters because a lot of right whales die by getting tangled up in lobster traps. Now, we actually got the Massachusetts lobstermen on board, so this is something that we can do. We can get industry partners. We can deal with the opposition, but it is a lot of work. It's important, and it's absolutely work that I will continue as president.
Let's go here with John Davis.
Yes. Before I start, I want to congratulate the House of Representatives. They have, I think it's called a climate caucus.
Yes, the Climate Solutions Caucus.
And it's bipartisan.
Right, it's actually very hard to join because, well, if you're a Democrat, you can't just sign up, you have to get a Republican to join with you. And I am very proud to be a member, so.
I've been a climate analyst for over 2 decades, and I was at the Paris Summit in 2015. Now, in that particular agreement, the countries of the world agreed to try to keep the temperature of the world below 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial standards. Unfortunately, we bypassed that already. We're in the 1.5 already. India had 1 week of 122-degree weather just 2 weeks ago. Alaska, 85 degrees. Kuwait, 127 degrees. This is all because of what we did. I'm a climate refugee because I live in southwest Iowa, and my cow was half obliterated because of the flood. My house was severely damaged. What I'm getting at is, if it continues to grow, and if we get at the 2% level, we're looking at mass extinctions. If we get to 3% level, hang that up, because we are at levels beyond even the Pliocene, where they had a great death. Now, the United States Congress gives hundreds of millions of dollars to the fossil fuel industry every single year. And in fact, the fossil fuel industry between 2009 and 2016 gave $2.5 billion to make sure there were nothing said in Congress about environment or climate. When you become president, would you get back on the Paris Agreement, cut the subsidies for fossil fuels, and reinstate all of the important rules and regulations that Trump has just trampled on? Because we
Yes,
know we're gonna
yes,
die.
and yes, but I would do a lot more. So, with regards to the money, I don't take money from fossil fuels in the industry, and I don't give it. That's my policy. Look, you're absolutely right. And part of what you're saying is that while it's important to get back into the Paris Accord, it really doesn't go far enough. And frankly, why is it the Paris Accord and not the Washington Accord, the New York Accord? We should be leading on this issue for the world, because it is an issue of national security, as we discussed. It is an issue of environmentalism. It is a moral issue for our time. We are literally not going to leave an inhabitable planet for future generations if we do not take aggressive action today. And so I'm completely with you. I think that we need to do a lot more in America to set the standard for the rest of the world. I was one of the first people to sign on to the Green New Deal, to say that this is a priority. But I also want to say that I've been critical of some of the things that have been added to the Green New Deal, because I think they detract from the focus on climate change. I do not think that the Green New Deal should be a socialist welfare program. I think the Green New Deal should address climate change and shouldn't be derailed by some of these other components that have been added to it. So here's what I think should be a part of the Green New Deal. There's sort of 3 big categories. First of all, America needs to lead again. We should be setting the climate standards. We should be leading the developed world in carbon-free generating technologies, and we should be selling that technology to countries like China, not the other way around. I don't want to see a future 10, 15, 20 years from now where we're still buying the most advanced solar panels in the world from China. They should be buying them from us. And that should apply to wind technology, to nuclear technology, to everything. One of the things I've been talking about in this campaign that some people think is a little bit pie in the sky is fusion energy. And I talk about it because of my background in physics and because I'm pretty good friends with some of the folks at MIT who are much closer to winning this race than we think. And that could be the future of power generation for the next century. And I do not want China to win that race, because it should be American companies with American jobs that are building these energy sources of the future and selling them to the rest of the world. Now, some of the critics of the Paris Accord say, well, okay, that's all well and good, Seth, that it makes these developed countries be accountable, but an increasing share, soon the majority share of carbon, will be coming from the developing world, not the developed world. And that is true. It's not a reason not to be a part of Paris, or to make Paris more aggressive, but we do have to deal with the developing world as well. But again, this is a place where we can grow our economy by developing the technologies that can be sold not just to the biggest cities in China, but to the small villages as well, to have carbon-free energy across the planet. And that is important for America to lead on as well. Third, we need to address carbon capture technologies. Now, this is something that's not always popular with the environmentalist community because some people hear carbon capture literally sort of vacuuming carbon out of the air, and they say, well, Seth, this sounds like an opportunity to just say we can keep polluting. Because what's wrong with a coal-fired power plant if you're just able to take the carbon out? Well, that's not right, but it is true that there's too much carbon up there already, and we've got to find a way to pull it out. So those are the three broad, very high-level things that should be a part of the Green New Deal. A way to lead for the developed world, to set the standard that other nations should follow. A way to sell technologies to the developing world so that we can cut down on all the small little villages around the planet that are creating an increasing share of the carbon going up into the atmosphere. And then third, developing carbon capture technology, something that we don't really have today, to start taking carbon out. That's the kind of leadership that we need to regain in America. So yes, I'll undo the bad things that Trump has done, but I'll go a lot further than that.
I do want to acknowledge a couple people who have come in. First of all, Cheryl Valena with Iowa 350. Thank you, Cheryl, for being here. City Council Member Ashley Van Orney. So thank you, Council Member Van Orney, for being here. And we got a question here. Billy Wilson's got a question for you.
In 2007, the renewable fuel standard was passed to help transition us away from petroleum fuels. Since then, it's been slashed here and there, and the current president's been doing an amazing job of just destroying it and moving us back to petroleum and carbon-based fuels. As president, what would you do to help support and strengthen the renewable fuel standard?
So as a proud owner with my wife of a Chevy Volt, I do not think this is the right way to be heading. And it's a great example of an issue where not only are we doing the wrong thing for the environment, for the planet, but we're really doing the wrong thing for our economic leadership in the world. Because the rest of the world is moving away from fossil fuel-filled vehicles. All right? So the rest of the world is going to get ahead of us in the standards for electric vehicles, and that means that our companies aren't going to be able to compete. So this is incredibly short-sighted, not just in terms of environmentalism, but in terms of our economic competitiveness. And it's another example of why we should not think of either dealing with climate change or increasing jobs, but that the two should go hand in hand. All right? Thanks.
All right.
I'm going to go here, and then here. Phil.
Hi, I'm with the Citizens Climate Lobby, and so obviously we
have a great group back in Massachusetts in my district too.
Excellent, yes. So obviously we're in favor of a carbon fee and dividend program, which I'm not at. Well, anyway, I noticed that you didn't mention a price on carbon emissions in your proposal.
No, I'm actually one of the few presidential candidates who explicitly says we should. We absolutely should. And a lot of people are sort of dancing around this issue because it's a politically contentious issue. But it makes economic sense. It's another place where the economics align with the environmentalism here. Putting a price on carbon, and I personally have signed on to the carbon fee and dividend program that Citizens Climate Lobby puts forward because I think that that's the right way to make it palatable, acceptable to the vast majority of Americans. But that's something we need to do, and we got to bite the bullet. And it's something I voted for in Congress. It's something I've advocated for, and it's something I've really tried to convince Republicans to support as well. There aren't many who support it in Congress, but there are a few.
Very good.
Hi, I was born in Boston. I grew up in the Massachusetts area, right? So, and I want to talk about remote work right, after the flood, the whole economy went down in Syria. I was actually working at university, I lost my job at that point, and I went up to Minneapolis, just left my house, right, went to Minneapolis, took a job up there.
Your house flooded?
It didn't flood, no, but I lost the job, right? But, and then, so it was like my cottage on the weekends, I'd come back and see my house, but eventually I was able to telecommute, right? And eventually they let me come back, right, to Cedar Rapids. And now I work out of my house. I, talk to the physicists all the time, talk to India and so forth, right? Every day, right? It seems like, a whole bunch of people, especially like in Boston, they're doing massive commutes and they're sitting in traffic for an hour, right? And it doesn't make any sense to me why people are doing that when they could work out of their house, or they could have, we could have WeWork spaces or something closer to where they work. This would help women a lot with small children, right? What's your feeling about maybe pushing this idea of localizing work, decentralizing work away from these big companies?
Well, I think that there are a lot of companies who have chosen to do that, but I don't think it's the role of the government to come in and tell a company how to run their company. And so I think there are places where, there was a time, 5 years ago when everyone said, no one's going to commute anymore because we're going to have this information technology and it's just going to bring people, and obviously that's worked well for you. But I think there are a lot of other companies who have realized that actually it's still really, face-to-face interaction really matters. And there's a difference between having a meeting remotely versus having a meeting in person. And so what I've been pushing in Massachusetts is not to force something down companies' throats and saying this is how you need to run your company, but that we need to have options for people to get into the city without cars. And so I am the leading advocate in Massachusetts, together with actually Governor Dukakis, he and I are our teammates on this, for what's called the North-South Rail Link, which will enable regional rail service in Massachusetts. The difference between regional rail and commuter rail service is that you can not just commute into work and commute home, but get around the state faster than you can driving by rail. This is the standard in the rest of the world, right? People in Japan don't get out of their cars and onto a train because, it's just too much traffic and it's too much of a pain, so I'll have to take this train even though it's slower. No, they get on the train because it's nicer and it's faster than driving. And our vision of rail in America is, Amtrak's pretty behind the times, folks. Most Amtrak routes, this is a little known fact, most Amtrak routes are slower today than those same train routes were in 1935. Think about that. So people don't take the train because it's not a good alternative. Because our systems are 100 years out of date. Because we've never built an interstate rail system like we built an interstate highway system. We still have the same tracks that were laid out in the 19th century. So in Massachusetts, the solution to Boston traffic is not building more roads. It's not just telling businesses how to conduct business. It's providing fast, efficient, modern, all-electric rail service that can go from the north of the city right through the city to the south, so that you can get from point A to point B faster than you can today. And that's a model that we should export to the rest of the country as well. I get the fact that there are some places in the country where rail is not a solution, but there are a lot more places that it would work if we had modern rail than exists today. Thanks. Water, if I may.
Yeah, we're drinking a lot of fluids today. Let's go here with a question.
Congressman, I want to applaud your passion and congratulate you on your attempt to get to the office.
Thank you.
I also want to thank you for coming to Iowa, especially Cedar Rapids, where we have a curious agreement and like for corn, since we are the largest contributor to corn, but we're also the largest contributor to the hypoxia in the Gulf. So
I saw a little bit of corn on my drive over here. Just a little bit.
Well,
If
they
you looked
say in
out the
Iowa,
window, you'd have seen beans.
they say in Iowa, you start the Mississippi, you see corn, what's that smell? Des Moines, corn, there's that smell. And then you hit the Missouri River. But to step back just a bit, if I could, to inquire, what's the geographic population of the congressional district in Massachusetts? Did you get it by gerrymandering? And probably more importantly, how do the occupations and the people or the populace of your congressional district, how do they match against either Iowa or the entire nation?
Okay,
Do you have any farms in your district?
Yeah, I got the gist of it. Yeah, all right, absolutely. Thank you very much.
Clarify it.
Boston?
So my congressional district, like most congressional districts, is about 750,000 people. That's the sort of the standard size because they're defined by population in the United States. To answer your gerrymandering question, my district is the original gerrymandered district in the world, in the universe, okay? Elbridge Gerry, if you really want to be a stickler, not Jerry, but Elbridge Gerry, great American patriot, his house still stands in Marblehead. And actually, I mean, I'm not here to give a history lesson, but we probably would not exist as a country if not for Elbridge Gerry and the work that he did with the French to save us from annihilation. Having said that, he unfortunately was remembered by a very bad thing he did, which was start gerrymandering. And it was my district that was made to look like a salamander, and thus gerrymandering was found. Now my district today is actually probably the least gerrymandered in all of Massachusetts. If you look at it on a map, it's a very normal shaped district, the way it should be. And it's a very diverse district. It includes cities like Lynn, Massachusetts that are majority minority, that are close to Boston. Lynn's about the same distance by train as Brooklyn is from downtown Manhattan. It's a place that has an industrial past, a growing future, but it's had a lot of hard times. A lot of immigrants, some crime issues, not great education system, but all things that we're working on. It also has cities like Newburyport, Massachusetts, that are thriving tourist destinations, former shipbuilding center right on the water. Gloucester, Massachusetts, with its iconic fisheries. You know, Gloucester cod is something that, you know, many of you probably eat when you get beer battered fish, even out here in Iowa. And west of Gloucester and Newburyport, there are a lot of small farms. Now, not big farms like you have out here, but a lot of small family-owned farms that generally focus on specialty things like organic produce. We have a lot of corn that grows in Danvers and Newbury. We have a lot of some livestock, but not very much. It's mostly organic stuff that people like to buy locally because they like to buy local produce and they're willing to pay a little bit of a premium for it. So believe it or not, we do have farming in Massachusetts, but it's just different farming than the much larger operations you have in general out here in Iowa.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
All right. I got a quick follow-up on that. One of the things I think is really important on the climate issue is to be able to bring Americans together around this issue. Now, there are always going to be those people who think it's a hoax, and you know, and they troll you on social media, and you just say, "Get behind me, troll!" Right? And you know, at some level, you're probably never going to get them. But how do you bring? You know, and I'm thinking about the question related to farmers. How would you approach this issue about bringing people together to address climate change? You already hinted at it with talking about the national security aspects of the issue. But what can you give us some advice on how you think that can be done? Because there is a point to this, which is this isn't a single bill that needs to be passed and we've dealt with climate change. This is now something we're going to live with the rest of all of our lives. We have to sustain the effort over decades, right? This is not a one and done situation. I think it's comparable in magnitude to the Cold War, right? Which took 4 decades, and America was sustained to that effort. So how do you think we can bring Americans together to address the climate issue?
So Rob, I want to start by answering this question by backing up a little bit and saying that I think that this question is fundamental, not just to addressing climate change, but to a whole other set of issues that we want to address as Democrats in this country right now. Because I have never seen America so divided. And I'm not as old as everybody in the room, but I've never seen this country more divided than it is today. And even if we win this election, we're not going to be able to accomplish any of the things we want to accomplish if we can't bring Americans together. And so as a candidate for president, this is core to why I'm running. And the unique experience that I bring to this race, as the only combat veteran, someone who's led troops in combat, my job as an infantry platoon commander on the ground was fundamentally to bring together this remarkably diverse group of Americans, people from all over the country, with different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, and get them all united behind a common mission to serve America. And I had to do that in a very divided environment, in the middle of a war that many of us disagreed with. And I was an outspoken critic of the Iraq War. But I led troops on the ground, and I kept going back to that war so no one would have to go in my place. And I wouldn't have been able to do that if I hadn't been able to bring these Americans together. So I think this is critical. You know, we want to deal with healthcare, for example. And healthcare, Democrats all agree that every American deserves healthcare. It's a human right. Healthcare for all. But we have a lot of debate about how to get there. And one of the things that people who are proponents of Medicare for all don't like to acknowledge is that, you know what, it wouldn't pass the House today because there aren't even enough Democrats to vote for it. So we've got to find a lot more unity in this country on a lot of these issues. And climate change is one of them. You know, we can we can say, all right, we'll pass something through the House, but it won't get through the Senate. Okay, so then we will win back the Senate. But at some point, Republicans are going to take charge. And if we don't figure out how to get Republicans on board, then none of this will be lasting change. So how do we do that? Well, part of my experience in the Marines is that you've got to find common ground with people who disagree with you. There's a certain extent to which just beating them over the head and saying, I know the facts and you don't, I'm right and you're wrong, that doesn't work. You got to find common ground. So I like to look for places where climate change hits on issues that are just traditionally important to Republicans and conservatives. One of them we talked about a lot, which is national security. It's why I use my place on the Armed Services Committee to be a big advocate for climate change, because that's a place where Republicans really listen. Another is the economy. You know, the Republican Party likes to fancy themselves the best party for the economy. Now, I have a lot of disagreements with that, right? But if you start talking about how climate change is impacting our businesses, is impacting our competitiveness, if you start pointing out that China is doing pretty well by developing the world-leading green technologies right now, and we should be leading that fight, it points out to Republicans that, yeah, this is an issue not just of, you know, taking care of whales and birds that are going to go extinct or whatever, as important as that is to me and you, but not important to some of these Republicans, right? It's an issue of our economic competitiveness. Our businesses are not going to be as successful. We're not going to have as high a GDP if we can't develop green technologies, if we can't compete in this world, if we're still developing all these cars that run on gas while the rest of the world is going to electric vehicles. So those are some examples of places where I try to find common ground with Republicans. And then there's some other things that I just, you know, I'll just leave those things aside. You know, I don't need to emphasize my disagreement with you on the biodiversity of the Brazilian rainforest if that's not going to convince you. Okay? I don't need to bludgeon you to death trying to convince you that I'm right on that, because you know what? You're right. I might just never convince you. But let's talk about some places where this impacts your life. And that's how you can get this done.
All right. Let's see, 3 more hands up. Let's try to do 3, 4. Let's try to do 4 more questions.
I just actually wanted to just add on your comment there.
Okay, let's go here, 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 and here. Cheryl.
Another big issue is health.
Great example. Thank you for saying
If we start talking
that.
about how climate change affects our health and where we live and the disruption that it's creating across our nation, across the world, I don't know how people can argue with that. You know, when you start talking about it affects our health directly. You know, it's just another piece.
It's a great example of is what I should add to national security and economic competitiveness. And Rob, you know, when we were doing our tour, you were saying how you had a lot of climate change skeptics, but ever since the flood, there haven't been so many skeptics. And it's an example of where you just show that it impacts their lives. And you've obviously been very successful at doing that. I mean, I hate to say with the help of the floods, but you know what? You could continue alienating people by talking about things that Republicans may not agree with. You've been able to focus on a place where, look, we're all in this boat together with the floods. It does come from climate change, and that's how you've been able to make so much progress. So,
Great.
for example, thanks.
Let's go back to Robin.
Congressman, like to tap into your military experience regarding climate change. My understanding is that the Pentagon is the largest user of fossil fuels dwarfing what we use domestically, and that we have, our government has some military bases maybe in 800 different places, and that we had soldiers killed in Nigeria when some of us didn't even know we had soldiers in Nigeria. So I guess my question is, in order to reduce consumption of fossil fuels, it would make sense to reduce the footprint of our military. And so I wonder, in your view, why do we need 800 bases around the world, and why do we need to intervene so frequently and so ferociously in so many countries so frequently?
Well, sir, I think one thing you'll notice if you look carefully at how people vote in Congress is that it's usually the combat veterans who are most skeptical of going to war, because we're the ones who've seen the costs. In fact, one of the most contentious issues right now before the Congress and before the Armed Services Committee is whether or not to have a new debate around the authorization for the use of military force for the longest war in American history that continues in Afghanistan. And that same authorization, that same legal authorization passed just after 9/11 has been used to justify not only the war in Afghanistan, but the ongoing conflicts in Syria, in Iraq, and many other places. And to the credit of my Republican colleagues, this is a place where Democratic and Republican veterans come together and agree. Congress is not doing its job. It's our job under the Constitution to decide when we put young Americans into harm's way. And we have refused to do that. We've allowed successive administrations, not even just this one, successive administrations to start these wars that, as you say, you don't even know about. And that's wrong. There are some places where we need to go to war. And I'm someone who's very strong on national security. But those are debates we should be having in Congress before the American people, because that's the constitutional obligation. There are other things that we can do to reduce the fossil fuel footprint of the Department of Defense. I think, just to be fair, the Department of Defense is the single biggest user of fossil fuels. It doesn't use more than like everyone driving cars, but it's the single biggest user, individual user. And so I support the United States Navy's efforts, for example, to invest in biofuels. And this is a project that started under the Obama administration but was canceled by the Trump administration. When it makes sense for our national security, that's something we should do. A lot of troops died in Iraq and Afghanistan, not fighting on the front lines, but just driving convoys of fuel up from Kuwait or out to remote bases far from Kabul. And if those bases had sustainable green energy sources, those young Americans wouldn't have died driving oil tankers. So there are a lot of places where, and this is another example of where you can find some commonality with people across the aisle. Everyone wants to save American lives. Everyone wants our troops to be safer. So why do we have bases running off of diesel generators when they could run off of solar power? Those are some of the things that we need to, those are some of the ways that we need the DoD to lead on climate and sustainability in a way that's actually better for our national defense and better for the lives of our troops. Thank you.
We actually have a company in Ames that makes flexible solar panels for the Department of Defense. And that's all they do. That's all they do. I mean, we've talked to them about, you ever want to do stuff in the domestic market? They're too busy. So they're set. Let's go here, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay. I've got kind of maybe a little bit different take. I'm a Republican, although it's been difficult to stay a Republican the last few years because I've just been appalled by what join us. You know, we still have some disagreements, but I've generally been appalled by what this president has been doing. And my question kind of revolves around the Mueller report. When are your colleagues in Congress going to start taking this seriously in terms of trying to educate the American people about what is in that report? It seems like a lot of your colleagues, and maybe you're one of them, haven't even read the report. They don't know what's in it. Your hearings have been behind closed doors. It doesn't seem like you're trying to make a case to the American people. And you know, it seems like you push back Mueller's testimony to apparently decide whether to have a professional or have congressmen ask questions. It seems like a lot of the hearings that you have had have been very ineffective because you have congressmen that simply want to grandstand rather than getting to the truth and having a professional, you know, experienced litigator ask questions in a more sustained format. So I guess, when is your party going to take this seriously, and when are they going to start trying to educate America about your case for impeachment? I greatly appreciated what you said, but I think you've got to make a case for that. And you're not going to be doing that by just saying Donald Trump's a potty mouth who we don't like. You've got to make a case. So when are you going to do
So,
that?
sir, first of all, thank you for coming here as a Republican, for being a part of this discussion. That means a lot. Second of all, I'm going to get you a copy of the speech I delivered this afternoon.
I heard it.
You did hear it.
Because
Because this is exactly what I'm talking about. And I think the simple answer to your question is that a lot of people in the Democratic Party right now feel that, for right or wrong, it would be a political mistake to pursue impeachment, to have these hearings, to get into the depths of the Mueller report. And my simple answer to this is, I don't care what the politics are. It's simply the right thing to do by the Constitution. I didn't swear an oath to protect and defend the politics of the Democratic Party. I swore an oath to protect and defend the Constitution of the United States, word for word, the same oath I swore as a United States Marine. So that is the duty that we have. Now, I actually, in addition to all of that, agree with you that we should be making this case, and I think it's in our political favor now to do so. I was actually the first candidate in this race to vote, not only to talk about impeachment, but to vote for it in the House of Representatives, way back in December of 2017, long before any other candidate came out in favor of it. And I just used the rationale that it's the right thing to do even though the politics are terrible. Now I think the politics are in our favor, because the American people need to hear this. And I have read the Mueller report, and it's pretty damn convincing. The Mueller report lays out very clearly, and if you haven't read it, by the way, it's daunting. I mean, and I haven't read every word, every footnote, but I have the whole thick thing. It's, like 600 pages, and it's daunting. So don't read the whole thing, just read the executive summary. Okay,
Read the whole
and,
thing.
and
It's
just
awful.
reading. Okay, so you want to read the whole thing? Fine. I'm trying to ease people into it, sir. I'm trying to ease people into it, right? If you just read the executive summary, you might well be inspired to read the rest. But it's so convincing. And remember when Mueller first released the report, and then, Fox News and the Republicans twisted it around and everything else, and so then he had to give a press conference later, and everyone's like, okay, what's the new stuff he's going to tell us? And he talked about how he clearly saw obstruction of justice, but he just wasn't allowed to pursue prosecution. All he was doing was reading from the report, folks. He wasn't telling us anything new. He was just getting up there in front of the American people at a press conference and reading word for word what was in the report that he had already submitted. So we just need to read the report. And we need to have this open debate before the American people so that everybody, whether you read the report or you just see a snippet on Facebook or TV, can understand what this is about and how serious the allegations are against the sitting president of the United States. And I do think that this, at the end of the day, will convince some Republicans to come over. Because one of the things you said is really key, which is that you said they're going to sort of stop talking about what a bad guy this is. Okay, well, I think it's a really important point. Because this election is about restoring moral leadership to the White House. But you know what? Republicans get that too. Republicans are not all stupid. They don't need a moral education from Democrats to say, oh, I know you don't understand this, but Donald Trump is actually a really bad guy. Like, he's a mean guy. Okay, they get this, folks. They've just said, I get the fact that he's a bad guy, but I want to vote for him for some other reason. I've written that off. That's part of the package. So I think Democrats need to win this election by not having a moral crusade against Donald Trump, but by just talking about where he hasn't lived up to his promises. One of which is to follow the laws of the United States of America. That's the case that we should be making. And one other thing. One of the reasons why this is so important is that when you just talk about Trump and what he's done wrong, and you don't have this sort of moral crusade, you're not insulting the people that you want to vote for us. You know, there are some people in this party who think that you deal with Trump by wrestling with him in the mud, by getting in this like back and forth argument. Well, look, you guys know more about pigs than I do, right? What happens when you wrestle with a pig in the mud? You get muddy, and the pig usually comes out happy, all right? And that's what happened. That's what's happened a lot with Trump. But there are other people in this race who want to just sort of ignore him and pretend he doesn't exist and say, oh, look, I just gave a talk for an hour and I didn't mention his name. Aren't you proud of me? He's the elephant in the room, folks. He's the guy we got to beat. We can't be afraid to confront him. Here's how I think you take on Trump. When he was complaining about the Mueller report a while ago, he said, this is the greatest witch hunt in American history. And I just said, you know, as a representative of Salem, Massachusetts, so you put him in his place, you remind everybody that he's wrong, just like having these hearings will do, all right? But you don't have to beat him over the head about it. You don't have to tell them they're bad people for supporting him, because we want to win him back. And I know a lot of good people who voted for Trump, and I'm sure you do too, including a lot of fellow veterans. And I want to convince them to come over to us. I don't want to guilt them into doing it. I want them inspired to vote for a Democrat. That's what we can do.
We've got one more question we're going to go over here. I apologize for that. I do want to mention, if you're interested in reading the Mueller report, we're having a Mueller report book club that will meet, has met once. It will meet again on Sunday, August 4th at 3 p.m. in the second floor. Not just Democrats, others are invited. 3 p.m. at the second floor conference room at the downtown Cedar Rapids Public Library. And let's go over here for the last question, and then we'll, Representative Moulton, you have time to stay and visit with people individually a little bit? Yeah. Okay, so let's go here, last question.
What do you think about the education and our infrastructure, like our teachers, the better pay? I have a friend that's a school teacher, he makes $38,000 a year, part of my friend.
Yes.
But $38,000 a year as a 4-year college degree, but you go to Casey's to make $52,000 a year with no degree. Tell me that picture right there.
We have to do a lot for education in our country. And you're absolutely right. We
Teachers
need.
have no respect in today's society in school because it comes from the parent pay. Why should he come home being stressed out? That's my issue with education. Teachers deserve to be paid for work that they put in.
There are a lot of stories to share here. My sister is a public school teacher. She teaches 10th grade history back in Massachusetts. One of the most striking was the morning I got in an Uber and was chatting with the driver, who explained that he is a school teacher himself, but he has to drive Uber because that's the only way he can pay the bills.
And the best part is, he
But on
has to
top
take
of that-
his own money and buy school supplies. For the budget.
So on top of that,
Sorry.
he said, you know, the reason I'm a teacher is that I actually used to be on the board. It's a private Catholic school in Washington. And he said, I used to be on the board of this school because I was a business leader. And the principal came up to me one day and said, we really need your help. And we appreciate your service on the board, but what we could really use is having you teach in the classroom. And so this man gave up his job at his company, where he was making a lot of money, enough to serve on the board of the school, and he became a teacher. And the reason he said he did it, he was a black man in Washington, D.C., is because, quote, growing up where I did, I shouldn't have had the opportunity to go to such a great college. But I did, and that's why I'm now teaching kids so they have that opportunity as well. But think about what he was saying. Growing up where I did, I shouldn't have had that opportunity. That's really messed up. That is not a country of equal opportunity. Where you grow up in a certain neighborhood with people who look a certain way or come from a certain background, and you say, you know what? I shouldn't get to go to a good school. maybe those white kids down the street or in another town or in a better city or in a different state, they get to go to good schools, but not me. No, because enshrined in our Constitution is the principle of equal opportunity. We are not a country of equal results. Some people are going to do better than others. But we are fundamentally supposed to be a country of equal opportunity. And there is no greater equalizer than our education system. But yes, we need to pay teachers more. We need to do a lot more than that, though, because our K through 12 education system was designed when? Does anyone remember? 1893.
There you go.
1893. I actually just sort of generally refer to this as about what you did, and then I had a New Hampshire voter who 2 days ago specifically cited the Education Act and everything else, and I was like, okay, whoa, I can't compete with that. So 1893. 1893, it was designed in response to the Industrial Revolution. Because people were coming off the farms and going into factories, and we said the education system we have isn't ready for them. Well, folks, we're going through a new revolution today. People call it the automated revolution. People aren't losing their jobs to immigrants, as the president says. We're losing them to robots. They're getting automated out of existence, and our education system is not built to respond. So we need to modernize our education system. One of the things we need to do is we need to put a lot more emphasis into vocational education. I've got lines out the door of the vocational schools in my district. So we need more opportunities for kids who want to go into those jobs. You know, computer programmers are actually starting to get automated. That's called machine learning. But it's going to be a long time before an electrician who comes in to fix these lights is replaced by a robot. So these are great jobs. My daughter is about this tall right now. She's only 9 months. Yeah, from the table up. Yeah. From the table up. It's tough, right? Yeah. And it's this great time in life because she has a great personality, but she doesn't run around and she doesn't talk yet. So she's an amazing. I mean, I'm like completely in love with this little girl. But she hasn't had a conversation with me yet about what she would like to do with her life. So I don't know if Emmy is going to go to college, or maybe devote her life to building the college or protecting the college. But I do know one thing, that as her dad, I will be proud of her no matter which role she chooses, and America should too. So we've got a lot of work to do with our education system. Not just to pay teachers more, although that's a very important first step, but to truly bring our education system into the 21st century so that we can prepare Americans to meet the challenges of the new economy, not just the old.
Thank you.
Seth Moulton.
You got some time to visit?
Yeah, of course, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody.
Extraordinary conversation.
I do, yes. Yes. I live in Salem. Beverly's just